I remember the exact moment his voice cut through the air and made my heart twist in a way I'd never quite experienced. "You're so outdated," my son-in-law Paul had said in that offhanded tone that suggested he thought I was nothing more than a relic of the past. There was something in the way his lips curled as he spoke, some semblance of pity laced with contempt, as though I were a dusty piece of furniture he'd been obligated to inherit. I didn't respond right away. My hand was trembling around the mug of lukewarm tea on the table, and I tried to steady it by gripping the handle tighter. In a single phrase, he made me feel obsolete in my own home, a place I'd painstakingly built over decades with my late husband. If he'd noticed how his words struck me, he gave no sign. He simply crossed one leg over the other, scrolled through the messages on his phone, and seemed to brush me aside as casually as one would dismiss a television show they'd grown tired of watching. My daughter, his wife, my own flesh and blood, did nothing to intervene. She stood in the corner of the living room, arms folded, eyes wandering from me to him, as though calculating which of us she should side with. I could see her mind racing, the little wheels turning, the edge of her lip bitten raw. She had changed so much since she married him? Or perhaps I had just missed the signals that this new version of her was always lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. I couldn't be sure, and perhaps I never would be. What I did know was that my world, once so stable, so certain, had been shaking for a while now, and Paul's remark was another weight thrown onto my shoulders. I withdrew to the kitchen, a retreat as much as an excuse to refill my tea. Nobody followed me or bothered to ask if I was all right. Their voices continued in the next room, muffled and inconsequential, as they discussed the next family gathering, which would apparently happen at my house, whether I liked it or not. That's how it went these days. My opinions were solicited only after everyone else had reached a consensus. As I ran the water into the kettle, I stared at the window overlooking the backyard garden. The tomatoes I'd planted last spring were still thriving in the raised beds, though the leaves were beginning to wither with the turning of the season. Time changes everything, doesn't it? That's the inevitability of life. It had changed me from a naive young woman into a mother, then into a widow, then into the caretaker of a property that held so many memories I could barely move through the halls without hearing echoes of the past. And now, I seem to be reduced to a caretaker for everyone else's whims. Outdated. That word rattled around in my mind like a stone caught in a tin can. It wasn't just about technology or the speed of progress, was it? No, it was a condemnation, a statement that my viewpoints and my ways of living, my sense of propriety, were no longer needed or respected. I had become an artifact in my own family. I pressed my palms against the cool countertop, letting the metal edge dig slightly into my skin. I'd felt powerless often in my life, but never like this. The humiliation was a slow burn, traveling from my chest and up to my cheeks. It took every ounce of discipline not to let them see how upset I was. But as the seconds ticked by, I found I was less upset than I was determined. That single condescending remark sparked a small flame in me, reminding me of all the times I had never responded, never fought back, always swallowed my pride for the sake of family harmony. My husband, Tom, had taught me gentleness and kindness, but never at the expense of my own dignity. And I realized with a pang of regret that since he passed, I'd been ignoring that crucial distinction, letting my grief and loneliness push me to appease people who took advantage of my vulnerability. Maybe Paul thought I was an easy target. Maybe he thought age had diminished my resolve. Perhaps he saw me as a battered fortress whose defenses had worn thin. I'd let them cross so many boundaries without protest. My daughter's dismissive shrugs, Paul's controlling approach to how they used the guest rooms, the times they brought up the possibility of me downsizing so they could make better use of the property, the subtle hints that I should pass on certain financial responsibilities to them since I was getting older. Then came that searing word, outdated. By the time the kettle whistled, I felt a clarity that had eluded me for the last few years. I poured the water over the tea leaves, let them steep, and inhaled. This house smelled of old wood and childhood memories. It was the place Tom and I had picked out when we were just starting out, determined to build a life here that was filled with love, compromise, and laughter. We had succeeded for many years. After his passing, the loneliness echoed through the halls at first. But then I found comfort in the familiar corners, the scratch marks on the door where we'd measured our daughter's height year by year, the squeaky floorboard near the fireplace that Tom always promised to fix but never did. This house was me, and I was this house. We'd become an intertwined story, and if Paul wanted to see it as some kind of archaic holdover from another era, well then maybe it was time he understood just how vital and relevant my presence truly was. I carried my fresh cup of tea back into the living room. My daughter, Candace, was perched on the edge of the sofa, leaning close to Paul, whispering something that made him nod in half-hearted agreement. They looked up simultaneously when I entered. I felt their guarded stares, as if I were an intruder to their private conversation. I imagined the scenario from an outsider's perspective. An older woman, shoulders slightly hunched from years of carrying burdens too heavy for her, facing a confident younger couple who exuded the kind of smug superiority that modern times sometimes bestow upon the next generation. It shouldn't have bothered me so much, but it did, because I was not ready to be cast aside like an antique in a modern showroom. I had value, my experiences had taught me resilience, and more importantly, I still had control I had almost forgotten about, until Paul's dismissal stoked the embers. I eased myself into the armchair across from them, sipping my tea in silence. Candace watched me warily, perhaps expecting an outburst, but none came. Instead, I just looked at them and allowed them to speak. They didn't, so I did. "When would you like to have this family gathering?" I asked evenly, and Paul's eyes flicked in that way people's do when they realize they've just been engaged by someone they deem irrelevant. I saw that uncertainty cross his face before he masked it with a confident smile. "I was thinking next Saturday," he replied, leaning back and placing an arm casually around Candace's shoulders. "We could invite everyone over, take advantage of the big dining room. You know, it's such a spacious place. It'd be a shame if it only gets used on holidays." My daughter didn't meet my gaze. She just stared at her hands. "I'll make sure we get enough groceries," she said softly, as if to smooth things over. I didn't push. I had no intention of fighting them on the matter. "That's fine," I said in a measured tone. "As long as you two do the cooking this time, my cooking methods might be outdated." The barb was gentle, but it landed. Paul smirked in a way that told me he was both annoyed and amused that I'd echoed his word. Good, let him feel that twinge. We spent the next hour discussing the details. More accurately, they spent the next hour talking, and I gave polite nods. My mind, however, was already racing ahead. For so long, I'd been the financial gatekeeper of this home, paying property taxes from Tom's life insurance, maintaining the upkeep from my own savings. But I rarely reminded them of that. I'd always felt it was crass to dangle money over family as a means of control or gratitude. But something in me had shifted. Maybe it was the heartbreak of losing Tom, maybe it was the slow realization that Candace no longer confided in me. Or maybe it was simply that single, heavy, laden word, outdated. Because I was anything but outdated in the matter of this house. In fact, my name was the only one on the official papers. There was no cosigner, no shared title. It was my deed, free and clear, left to me solely after Tom's passing. And that meant that no matter how condescending Paul might be, no matter how dismissive Candace was becoming, they had no real claim here unless I allowed them. I'd never used that leverage before, but for the first time, I started thinking about how the dynamic would shift if I did. After they left, I wandered through the empty house, the floors creaking beneath my steps. In the upstairs hallway, I paused at the family portraits hanging on the wall. There was Tom, with his warm, playful grin, his arms slung around a much younger version of me. Next to that photo was one of me holding Candace as an infant, both of us beaming with the uncomplicated joy of new life. Candace's wedding photo was the last in the row, her white dress glimmering in the summer sunlight, Paul standing tall beside her, so confident, so sure of himself. I sighed, brushing my fingertips across the wooden frame. I wanted to remember that day in a positive light, the day my daughter found someone to start a life with, the day our family expanded. But in the reflection of the glass, I saw the lines of worry etched into my own face, lines that had formed from the strain of bridging two worlds that no longer seemed to speak the same language. Perhaps Paul's mother had felt similarly about me. I tried to recall if she'd ever given me that subtle condescending look, but no, she was always polite, always warm, if a bit distant. Whatever friction existed in this new generation, it felt more cutting, more brash. I moved to the guest room, where Candace and Paul often stayed when they came for holidays. It was neat, almost impersonal, just the way they left it. The bed was made with crisp sheets and the pillows were fluffed. They brought their own style with them each time they visited. Modern gadgets, minimalist decor. Sometimes it felt like they were testing how easily they could replace the older furnishings in my house. I'd find new pillows or curtains in the closet, replaced without my knowledge. Maybe they saw it as helping me modernize. Or maybe it was a quiet, creeping takeover, one small item at a time. I ran a hand across the old oak dresser, a piece my mother used to own. There was a small scratch on its surface that Candace made as a child, when she'd excitedly climbed on top and knocked over a lamp. It felt like a story etched into the wood. A memory, a moment from the past. Was that scratch outdated too? Should I toss it out because it showed signs of wear? The idea alone made me angry. This was not just furniture. It was part of my life's tapestry. They didn't understand that. Or maybe they simply didn't care. I could feel the tears burning the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, I squared my shoulders. Fine, let them think I'm old-fashioned, clinging to a past that no longer exists. They don't realize that this past is what shaped me, what taught me how to stand firm in the face of disrespect. A memory bubbled up unbidden, my father teaching me to read the legal documents for his small business, showing me how to verify signatures, how to never sign something without understanding it fully. I'd learned about deeds and ownerships early on, but I never imagined I'd one day hold a deed over my family's heads. It felt contradictory to the values I believed in. Yet here I was questioning whether those values still held any worth in the eyes of people who so casually dismissed me. Over the next few days, I settled into a strange, quiet determination. I went about my daily tasks, shopping for groceries, tidying the house, listening to music that reminded me of simpler times. But underneath it all, there was a new undertow in my thought. I started pulling out important documents from the old chest in my closet, carefully examining them for the details I'd let fade into the background over the years. There it was, the deed to the house, legally signed and solely under my name. I ran my finger along the date, recalling how Tom and I toasted with cheap champagne the day we paid off the mortgage. It had been such a triumphant moment, the culmination of countless sacrifices. We'd never even considered putting Candace on the door when she got married. Why would we? It was our home, our safe haven. And now, it was my only remaining fortress. Holding that paper, I felt an unexpected rush of confidence. A sense of power, but also of sorrow. Power because I knew that no matter how many jabs Paul took at me, I was the final say in this household. Sorrow because it meant I might actually need to brandish that power. The family gathering that next Saturday was a boisterous affair. Uncles and aunts arrived, along with cousins I rarely saw. The house was filled with chatter and the scent of various dishes. Candace and Paul took charge in the kitchen, as promised, though I noticed Paul delegating most of the actual work to Candace, while he played host, charming the relatives and occasionally dropping pointed comments about how these older houses could really use an update. I wandered through the clusters of relatives, offering small smiles, refilling drinks, and pretending not to notice the hush that fell whenever I neared a group that had been discussing me. I could sense that word outdated floating in the air, like a stale odor that refused to dissipate. Several times, Paul found ways to mention how things would change around here once we get everything settled, or how the property could be so much more valuable if it was used differently. He was a maestro conducting a silent symphony of insinuations. And Candace, for her part, seemed torn. I saw the guilt in her eyes whenever she glanced at me, but she never spoke up to counter Paul's suggestions. The final straw came after dinner, when everyone was relaxing in the living room. Paul took the center stage, flashing that confident grin as he told a humorous story from his workplace. Then, in a casual pivot, he started talking about real estate trends. how the area was booming, how a vintage property like mine could fetch a high price on the market. I sat in the armchair again, quietly listening. An uncle chimed in, praising Paul's financial acumen. Another relative said something about how it was a shame to keep such a large house for just one person. Exactly, Paul said with a bright smile. Then he turned to me, his eyes shining with what I recognized as condescension masked as concern. Mom, have you ever thought about maybe moving into a smaller place, something more modern, more suited to your current needs? A hush fell. I could see Candace close her eyes briefly, as if anticipating the impact. My heart pounded, and I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced myself to remain calm. I glanced around at the circle of faces, some curious, some expectant. I appreciate your concern, I said softly, but I've lived in this house for most of my life. I'm not interested in moving anywhere else. Paul didn't back down. If anything, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking like a lawyer cross-examining a witness. But think of the upkeep, he pressed. The property taxes alone must be huge. If you sold this place, you could afford a nice condo, maybe even closer to Candace and me. We could help you more that way. I nodded slowly, feeling the old frustration coil tighter. I'm sure you'd be very helpful, I replied, letting the words hang with an edge of sarcasm. He caught it, but he didn't relent. I just worry about you, he added, with a faux sympathetic tilt of his head. Candace does too. We hate to see you stuck in the past, with all this old stuff. Times are changing, you know? We gotta keep up or else you become… Well, he trailed off, but the implication was loud and clear. Outdated. I inhaled, letting the breath steady me. With my gaze drifted over to Candace, who looked down at her lap. She should have been the one to speak up. She should have told him that this was my decision, my life. But she didn't. Thank you for your concern, I said, the same phrase I'd repeated so many times in the past months. I'll let you know if I ever decide to make changes. The rest of the evening carried on in that tense undercurrent. Nobody brought it up again in front of me, but I caught the hushed conversations, the sideways glances. I smiled, cleared plates, offered dessert. If they thought I was going to crack from their pressure, they were mistaken. Because I'd already made a plan that both saddened and thrilled me in equal measure. After the guests left, Candace and Paul stayed behind to help clean up. The silence between us was thick. I could sense Candace's need to say something, but she never found the words. Instead, she scrubbed the dishes at the sink while Paul fiddled with his phone at the table. When he finally spoke, his words were directed at me. You know, you should consider letting us at least manage the place for you, he said, not bothering to look up from the screen. It's a lot for someone in your position. My position, I repeated quietly, stepping into the living room to collect stray cuts. Yes, you know, alone, getting older, he said, as though it was a well-meaning suggestion. Candace and I could handle the taxes, the bills, everything. You just enjoy your retirement. I smiled a tight smile he couldn't see. Retirement. Another way to say, fade quietly into the background. Let the next generation take over. Become an invisible caretaker while they reap the benefits. I appreciate your enthusiasm, I replied, carrying the cups into the kitchen and placing them in the sink. I could feel Candace tense beside me. She was waiting for a confrontation. But I'd already decided there wouldn't be one. At least not in the way they expected. Think about it, Paul said, standing up and stretching. It's for your own good. And for ours, too, if we're going to raise a family here someday. The house is perfect for kids, lots of room to run around. It's just too big for one person. I nodded absently, keeping my thoughts to myself. I didn't trust myself to speak without letting my anger seep out. So I remained silent, letting him fill the void with his confident plans. Eventually, they finished cleaning and left. I walked them to the door, hugging Candace. She clung to me for a moment, and I almost believed I felt an apology in the way she pressed her cheek against mine. Then Paul said his goodbyes, that smug, practiced grin in place. I watched them drive away, the taillights disappearing into the night. My heart pounded with a mixture of sorrow and anticipation. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a moment, pressing my forehead to the old wood. This house had always been a sanctuary. Now it was becoming a battlefield. Over the course of the next week, I made my preparations carefully. I scanned documents into my computer, ensuring I had digital copies of everything: bank statements, the deed, legal records. I composed an email draft that I knew would send shockwaves through Paul's overconfident worldview, but I didn't send it yet. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to be absolutely certain I was ready for the fallout, because once I took this step, there would be no going back to the quiet acceptance that had defined my life for the past few years. Each morning, I woke up before dawn. I'd sit in my lightened. Memories of Tom would come in waves, and his gentle nudge to get me out of bed, his off-key singing as he made breakfast, his unwavering support whenever I felt like the world was moving too fast. I missed him terribly. I thought about how different life would have been if he were still here, if he could have guided Candace through these difficult transitional years, if he could have softened Paul's sharper edges. But that was a dream. Reality was me, alone, with a piece of paper that represented my entire life's security. I found myself opening old photo albums more often, flipping through pictures of birthday parties, holiday gatherings, the renovations Tom and I completed with our own hands. I laughed at the memory of us attempting to install new cabinets in the kitchen one summer. Tom had nearly lost a finger, and I'd almost set the house on fire with a faulty wiring job. But we learned, and we laughed. And in the end, we made this place our home. Outdated, perhaps, but ours. And I refused to let that be erased by some mug condescension. The next Saturday, Candace invited me to dinner at their apartment. I could sense her attempt at smoothing things over. She texted earlier in the day, telling me she missed me and wanted to have a small get-together, just the three of us. I accepted. As I prepared to leave, I printed out a fresh copy of the deed and tucked it into my purse, just in case. I wasn't entirely sure I'd reveal it yet, but I liked having it with me. A reminder that I was not powerless. Their apartment was sleek and modern, all chrome and glass surfaces with minimal clutter. In the foyer, there was a coat rack that looked more like a twisted art installation than something functional. The living room had a large flat-screen television mounted on a stone feature wall. It looked like an interior design magazine spread, immaculate and impersonal. Candace greeted me with a quick hug. Paul offered a handshake, which felt strangely formal. The meal was pleasant enough, though not quite the warm, family-style dinner I remembered from years past. We ate at a small dining table near the open-concept kitchen. Candace had prepared a lovely roasted chicken, and the conversation remained polite, if a bit forced. Small talk about the weather, about traffic, about some upcoming work event Paul had. "Did you get a chance to think about what we discussed last week?" Paul asked suddenly, cutting into his chicken. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "Which part?" I asked mildly. "The part about moving or the part about letting you handle my finances?" He smirked, swirling his fork through the sauce on his plate. "Both, really. We just want what's best for you. It's not easy to keep up with bills, property taxes, maintenance, especially when technology is so advanced these days. It can be confusing if you're not used to it." That condescending tone again. Candace looked at me apologetically. I set my fork down. "I've been paying bills and taxes long before you were born," I said, my voice calm. "I don't think I need help understanding how it works." He nodded, but the glint in his eye told me he wasn't about to back down. "Sure, you've been doing it a long time, but times change, you know. Some of those old systems just don't cut it anymore. You might miss a deduction here or there, or not handle the online aspects correctly." I took a slow breath. "I handle online transactions just fine." "We're not doubting your intelligence," Candace interjected, trying to mediate. "We just want to simplify things for you. You've been through a lot." I felt a pang at her words, a gentle reminder of Tom's death. But I was not going to let grief be used as a bargaining chip. "I appreciate the concern," I said slowly, "but I'm going to keep doing things the way I see fit. When I need help, I'll ask for it." Paul's eyes flicked toward Candace. There was a silent exchange between them, something I couldn't quite decipher, but it seemed like frustration on his end and guilt on hers. We finished dinner in a strained quiet. Afterward, we moved to the living room. Paul turned on some background music, something contemporary and mellow. Candace brought out a bottle of wine and we sipped in silence for a while. Eventually, Paul cleared his throat. "We'd like you to consider drafting a new will," he said abruptly. My heart lurched, but I kept my face impassive. "A new will," I repeated. "Yes," he continued, "one that accounts for the modern reality of your estate. There could be advantages in terms of taxes, distribution, that sort of thing. It might also make sense to add Candace, or both of us, to the deed. That way, if something happens, knock on wood, there won't be any complications." The nerve of him. He made it sound so casual, as though it was the next logical step in organizing my demise. My palms itched, and I was glad I'd placed my wine glass on the coffee table because I didn't trust myself not to throw it. Candace placed a hand on my knee, a reassuring gesture that only made me feel more cornered. "Mom, this is just to protect you," she said softly. "We don't want you to worry about anything. You've done so much for us already." I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. The words hovered at the back of my tongue. Outdated, protect, worry. Everything in me wanted to lash out, to tell them how hurtful and manipulative it felt. But I fought down the anger, letting a cool, controlled sense of purpose take over. "I'll consider it," I said evenly. That was all. Paul seemed momentarily satisfied. He nodded, leaning back into the sofa, taking another sip of wine. "Glad to hear it," he said, crossing his legs. "We can set up a meeting with a lawyer if you want. I have some contacts at a firm downtown." The conversation drifted to other topics after that, but the tension remained thick, like a fog nobody could quite clear. I left soon after, with Candace walking me to the door, an apology in her eyes that she couldn't put into words. I kissed her cheek softly. "I love you," I whispered. She nodded, tears brimming, but she didn't speak. I let the door close behind me and walked away feeling more resolved than ever. That night, I turned on my laptop, reopened that draft email, and began typing in earnest. My hands shook slightly at first, but as the words filled the screen, I found my composure. I wrote to Paul, addressing him formally, outlining my perspective on the matter of my home, my finances, and the respect I expected as a mother and mother-in-law. I didn't hold back. I stated clearly that while I might be older, I was still fully capable of handling my affairs. Then, in the final lines, I inserted a scanned copy of the deed, my name clearly emblazoned as the sole owner, free of any liens or debts. A quiet, undeniable assertion of my authority over the property he seemed so eager to control. I hovered over the send button for a few minutes, heart pounding. If I sent this, it would be a catalyst, a revelation of the boundaries I was setting. I knew it might lead to conflict, perhaps a confrontation of an intensity we'd never had before. But I also knew I couldn't continue to cower beneath his judgments, nor could I watch my daughter slip further away without understanding where I stood. Finally, I clicked send. The whoosh of the email flying off into cyberspace was almost anticlimactic, but it resonated in my chest like a distant thunder. I stared at the screen, half expecting an immediate reply, but nothing came. Of course, it was late. Paul was likely asleep or immersed in something else. I shut the laptop, turned off the lights, and made my way upstairs to my bedroom. In the silence of that night, alone with my thoughts, I felt an odd combination of fear and liberation. What if they hated me for this? What if Candace saw it as an act of aggression and chose to pull away permanently? The idea terrified me. I wasn't doing this to alienate her. I was doing it to protect myself from being swallowed up by their dismissive attitudes. Outdated. The word still stung. But now I had asserted something more powerful than a mere retort. I had shown them unequivocally that I was not a helpless relic. I still had control, and I wasn't afraid to wield it. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it finally did, I dreamed of Tom. We were sitting on the porch in the early morning, sipping coffee together. He was telling me not to worry, that everything would work out as it should. The dream felt so real that when I woke, I half expected to find him beside me, that comforting weight in the bed. But of course, there was only emptiness. I lay there for a moment, remembering the details of his face, the warmth of his smile, the subtle lines that crinkled around his eyes when he laughed. I whispered a soft thank you into the stillness, as if he'd truly been there, giving me his silent blessing. The next morning, I kept my phone nearby. Sure enough, around 8 a.m., frustrated with an incoming call from Candace, my heart skipped. I hesitated before answering, bracing myself for the fallout. Mom, she began, her voice shaky. Paul showed me the email. Why would you send something like that? I closed my eyes, took a breath. Because I needed him to understand, I said gently. To understand that I'm not a child to be coddled, and I'm not incompetent, and I'm certainly not outdated. There was a pause. I could almost hear her gathering her words. He feels like you're threatening us, she said finally. I snorted softly. Threatening you by stating that the house is mine and that I intend to keep it that way unless I choose otherwise. Candace exhaled, clearly flustered. Mom, it's the tone. And attaching the deed, it's a reminder, I interrupted, trying to keep my frustration at bay. A reminder of who actually owns this home and who gets to decide what happens to it. Paul made it clear he thinks I should move or let you two take over. That's not going to happen right now. She went quiet for a moment. But why not talk to us in person? Why an email? Her voice had a fragile edge, like she might cry at any second. I softened my tone, because every time I try to talk to you in person, I'm dismissed. He dismisses me, makes decisions without me, and you go along with it. I needed to say this clearly in a way that can't be argued over or talked down. I needed you both to see it in writing. She sniffled. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry if you felt bulldozed. That was never my intention. I guess I thought Paul had good ideas, that maybe we could all be a family in a simpler way. My heart tightened. We can still be a family, I said quietly, but I won't be sidelined. Okay, she said, swallowing a sob. Let me talk to him. He was really upset this morning, but maybe once I explain. I love you, I reminded her, my own throat constricting. I'm doing this out of love for myself, for the memory of your father, and for you too, in a way, so you'll see me for who I am and not who Paul wants me to be. Candace muffled another sniffle. I love you too, Mom. We'll figure this out. After we hung up, I felt a wave of relief and sadness all at once. There was no yelling, no screaming, just raw confusion and heartbreak in her voice. Part of me wanted to run to her, hold her, tell her everything would be okay, but a larger part of me knew this confrontation was necessary. I didn't hear from Paul directly for another week. During that time, my emotions ran the gamut, from doubt to defiance. I found myself waiting for a vicious email or a furious phone call, but none came. I busied myself with chores, with visiting old friends, with walking around the block every evening, savoring the autumn air. Eventually, Candace called to say that Paul wanted to come over to talk, just the two of us. She seemed nervous, but I agreed. Better to have it out in the open than let it fester in silence. He arrived on a brisk Sunday afternoon. I greeted him at the door, noticing the tension in his jaw. He wore a well-fitted coat, and his hair was neatly styled, but I could see the stress in the lines around his eyes. We settled in the living room, neither of us offering small talk. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. I didn't realize you felt so strongly, he said finally, clasping his hands together. I studied him. He seemed earnest, but I knew how easily he could slide into manipulation. I'm not sure how else I could have told you, I replied, my tone steady. You weren't listening. He nodded. I get it. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe our ambitions clouded our perspective. I waited, not offering him an easy out. He continued, look, I want a good relationship with you. I never intended to disrespect you. But this house, this property, it's big. And in my mind, it was an opportunity to build something better for Candace and me, for future children, you know. I thought maybe you'd be open to that idea. Maybe I shouldn't have assumed. I sipped from a glass of water, letting the moment stretch. This place is my home, I said quietly. Tom and I built our life here, and after he passed, it became the anchor that kept me from drifting into despair. It's where Candace grew up, where memories live. I'm not ready to give that up because you see it as an opportunity. He swallowed. I understand that now. It's just, You have to admit it's not practical for you to stay here alone. I bristled at the word practical, but I tried to remain calm. Maybe not, but it's my decision, my life, and I'll handle the consequences, including financial ones, if that's what it comes down to. He nodded again, looking out the window. The backyard was radiant with autumn leaves, a golden tapestry that seemed to shine in the afternoon sun. I'm sorry for calling you outdated, he said finally, barely above a whisper. I pressed my lips together, feeling that old wound twinge. And I'm sorry for dropping that email without warning. But you needed to see it. He let out a breath. Yeah, I did. Look, can we start over? I know things won't be perfect right away, but I do care about Candace's relationship with you. I care about you too in my own way. I just have a habit of rushing. I studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. He seemed genuine, but I also knew how adept he was at saying the right things to smooth over conflict. Still, I had made my stance clear. Whether he was being manipulative or honest, my boundaries were now unmistakable. We can try, I said softly, but I won't tolerate being spoken to like that again. I won't tolerate any further attempts to push me out of my own life. Do you understand? He nodded. The silence that followed was heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. I felt the tensions of months past lingering between us, a dense fog that would take time to fully dissipate. Eventually he stood. I should go, he said, glancing at his watch. Candace was worried about how this might go. She'll want to hear that we didn't kill each other. I gave a small, wry smile. Tell her I'm fine, and we'll talk soon. He headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. About your suggestion in the email, he began, but hesitated. What suggestion? I asked. I was genuinely confused. He cleared his throat. Where you said that if we really wanted to help, we could contribute to the maintenance costs without expecting control in return. If that offer still stands, maybe we can figure out a system that works for everyone. I met his gaze, somewhat surprised. Let's take it slow, I said, one step at a time. He nodded and left. I locked the door behind him, leaning against it, just as I had the night I first sent that email. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, marveling at how drastically a person's perspective could shift when forced to confront reality. Candace visited a few days later without Paul. She seemed lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. We sat in the kitchen, drinking tea. She apologized again, tears in her eyes, for not defending me, for letting Paul's ambitions overshadow her own love for me. I accepted her apology, though I knew the trust between us would take time to rebuild. It felt like a new chapter was beginning, still uncertain, still tinted with the memory of painful words, but at least it was honest. The next few weeks saw an uneasy calm settle over my life. Paul and Candace still had opinions, of course, and I occasionally caught Paul suggesting updates to the house that rubbed me the wrong way, but he no longer insisted, and I no longer felt the need to swallow my objections. I began to speak my mind more freely. If something didn't sit right with me, I said so. It was almost startling how different I felt, as though I'd found a part of myself that had been locked away since Tom's death, a sense of self-worth that said, I matter, my home matters, my decisions matter. One evening, as I was rearranging some old books in the living room, I found a framed photograph of Tom holding Candace when she was just a toddler, perched on his shoulders. Her chubby arms were thrown out in excitement, her eyes bright with wonder. Tom's grin was pure joy. I clutched the photo to my chest, feeling a wave of nostalgia. If he were here, would all this conflict have happened? Possibly not. He had a way of keeping the family woven together. But then again, perhaps this was a lesson I needed to learn on my own, how to stand firm without his hand in mine. I smiled at the photo, tracing their faces with my fingertips. I'm not outdated, I whispered to them, as if they could hear me. I'm still here, still me. And in that quiet moment, I felt a gentle acceptance wash over me. I would always miss Tom, but I was not alone. I had memories, I had resolve, and I had the knowledge that I could still fight for my place in this world, no matter who tried to shove me aside. In the following months, Paul's attitude continued to mellow. He even helped me repair a few things around the house, carefully listening to my instructions. There were tense moments, of course, especially when he'd make a comment that towed the line, but they became fewer, and Candace was quicker to speak up now, reminding him that this was my domain. We found a new normal, an uneasy truce built on respect that was no longer optional. Sometimes I'd catch Paul studying me quietly, perhaps trying to figure out if I'd changed or if I'd always been this strong, and he'd simply never noticed. I didn't volunteer an answer. It was enough for me that he recognized I wouldn't bend as easily as he'd assumed. As for the deed, I kept the original copy in my closet, lumped in a fireproof box. The scanned version remained on my computer, a silent declaration of independence. I didn't wave it around or threaten to disinherit anyone. That was never my intention. But it remained a potent reminder to both me and them of where we each stood. Ironically, the day I decided to attach that document to an email was the day I discovered a new sense of belonging within myself. I was no longer shadowed by old heartaches or new disrespect. I was the mistress of my own fate, living in a home that held a lifetime of love and memories, and I was ready to face the future on my own terms, whether people found that outdated or not. A few days after Paul and I had our serious talk, I heard a soft tapping at my front door. Just after dusk, Candace stood there, wearing a loose sweater and jeans, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. I invited her in, and she stepped inside, glancing around as if seeing the place anew. We ended up in the living room, where she gently traced the edges of the old photo frames. "I remember Dad used to lift me on his shoulders to change that clock," she said, pointing to an antique clock mounted above the fireplace. I nodded, recalling how Tom would grumble about the precarious position, but do it anyway, to hear Candace giggle. "I think," she said, her voice quivering, "I got so caught up in adulthood, in marriage, and wanting things to be perfect, that I forgot where I came from." She turned to me, tears brimming in her eyes again. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for not standing up for you, for letting Paul's plans overshadow your happiness. You're my mother. You've sacrificed so much." I moved closer, wrapping my arms around her. She trembled against me. "It's okay," I whispered, though we both knew it would take time. "You're here now. We can move forward." She pulled back, swiping at her tears. "I just wanted you to know, I don't think you're outdated," she said, a small, apologetic smile tugging at her lips. "I think you're strong and wise, and I hope one day I can be as resilient as you." My own eyes grew moist. "You already are," I assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. That night, we talked for hours, delving into topics we hadn't touched in years, her fears about marriage, her memories of her father, my struggles with loneliness after Tom passed. It was the kind of conversation I'd been longing for, a raw and unfiltered connection between mother and daughter. By the time she left, I felt a renewal in our bond. I locked the door behind her and sank onto the sofa, relief washing over me. The conflict had not magically dissolved. There would be other disagreements, other moments of tension. But for now, I felt the threads of our relationship mending, weaving themselves into a new pattern that included honesty, respect, and mutual understanding. In the days that followed, Paul seemed more polite, more careful with his words. He even asked my opinion on some minor repairs in their apartment, a gesture perhaps to show he was trying to include me in decisions rather than bulldoze me with his own agenda. I appreciated the effort, small though it was. Candace continued to visit regularly, sometimes bringing groceries or small gifts, an unspoken testament to her willingness to make amends. I never asked her to do it, and I made sure she knew I didn't expect it. But I could see she needed to show her love in tangible ways. By the time winter approached, the house took on a familiar hush. The snow blanketed the garden outside, and I'd often find myself sipping tea by the window, watching the flakes drift lazily down. I kept my phone close, often exchanging texts with Candace, small everyday updates that reminded me she was thinking of me. Gone were the days of feeling invisible. I still had to check Paul occasionally. His ambition didn't evaporate overnight, and he'd occasionally drift into talk of investments and modernizing, but now I had a firm voice. "I understand your idea," I'd say, "but this is how I prefer to do it." And that was that. He began to respect my no, or at least not challenge it outright. One day, as I was going through some old boxes in the attic, I found an old baby blanket I'd crocheted when I was expecting Candace. It was frayed at the edges, discolored in places, but the memories it held made it priceless. I washed it carefully, folded it, and placed it in a fresh box, labeling it for future grandchildren if the time came. It struck me as I did so that I was no longer afraid of the future. I wasn't clinging to the past out of fear or stubbornness. I was preserving what mattered while acknowledging that life inevitably moves forward. And that's when the realization hit me. I could be both rooted in tradition and open to new possibilities. Being outdated had never really been about how I operated. It was about how others perceived me. Once I asserted my stance, I became timeless. I was no longer locked in a category of the old and obsolete. I was simply myself, a continuum of experiences and lessons learned. When the holidays came around, we hosted a family gathering at my house again. This time, though, it felt different. Paul was more respectful, Candace more attentive, and I was more at ease. We decorated the tree together, shared stories of Tom, laughed over old photos. The tension that had lingered in corners for months seemed to have receded. Not entirely gone, but at least subdued. My extended family noticed. An aunt of mine pulled me aside at one point and said, "You look happier, dear. Did something change?" I smiled at her and said, "I just remembered who I am, that's all." The days rolled on, and with them came small steps of progress. Paul and I might never see the world the same way. There was a generational gap, a difference in core values that wouldn't vanish. But we found a common ground in our love for Candace and the potential for a deeper family bond. We agreed to compromise on small matters. He'd help me set up a better online system for paying bills, one that I controlled, and I'd consider letting him modernize a few features in the house, so long as they didn't erase its character. We navigated these waters cautiously, each aware of the wounds that had been inflicted. But we were trying, and that was more than I could have hoped for when he first uttered that damning word. One afternoon, as I was busy in the kitchen baking cookies for a neighborhood fundraiser, I heard a ping from my laptop. It was an email from Paul. My stomach clenched momentarily, memories of that fateful message I'd sent him flooding back. But curiosity won out, and I opened it. The email was brief, but to the point. He thanked me for letting him help with a small repair in the upstairs bathroom and said he appreciated the trust I'd shown by granting him access to the house, even when I was out. He apologized again for his past behavior and reiterated that he wanted to ensure we maintained open communication. I stared at the screen, momentarily stunned. Could people really change so much in such a short period? Or was he simply learning how to navigate me more skillfully? I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, his tone seemed earnest, and I typed a quick reply. "Thank you for your help. Let's keep working on this together." Then I returned to my cookies, humming a quiet tune, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. I realized in that moment that sending that email with the deed attached might have been the most liberating act of my life. It wasn't about brandishing power for the sake of dominance. It was about reclaiming a sense of autonomy and respect that had been slowly chipped away. I'd always worried that confronting family would destroy the fragile bonds we had left after Tom's passing. Yet, ironically, it strengthened them. Or maybe it didn't strengthen them. Exactly. Rather, it exposed which bonds were real and which were illusions. And with Paul, I was beginning to believe that there was something genuine there, beneath his bravado. As the winter gave way to spring, I spent more time in the garden, preparing the soil for planting. One afternoon, Candace joined me, kneeling beside me in the dirt, pulling weeds and turning the soil. She asked if I remembered the small herb patch I used to keep behind the shed. "Oh, I remember," I said, laughing. "You used to sneak out at night to harvest rosemary and mint so you could make potions for your dolls." She giggled, a sound that warmed my heart. I was convinced I was a witch, or at least an apprentice. We laughed together, the sound mingling with the chirping of birds. After a while, she paused, resting her hands on her knees. "Paul told me that you two had a good conversation," she said, a note of relief in her voice. "He said he understands now that this house is more than just a piece of property." I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. I'm glad he does. It'll make life easier for all of us. She glanced at me, her eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and lingering remorse. Thank you, Mom, for standing up for yourself. I know it must have been hard, but I think it was exactly what we needed. Her words took me by surprise. I tilted my head, curiosity piqued. Why do you say that? She scooped some soil in her hands, letting it crumble through her fingers. 'Cause I was drifting away. Well, I didn't see it then, but I was letting myself be swept up by Paul's ambitions, by this idea that we had to move forward at all costs. I was losing sight of what matters: family, history, roots, your story, Dad's story. Her eyes flickered with old sadness. I miss him too, Mom. It's just I sometimes bury that grief in planning for the future. Paul does the same in his own way, with his drive and ambition. But you reminded us both that the past isn't something to discard. I placed a hand on hers, feeling the warmth of a shared pain. I'm glad you see that now. She looked around, surveying the yard, the house beyond. This place, it's full of memories. It's where I learned to be me. I don't want to lose that. And I don't want to lose you. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. You won't, I assured her. Not as long as we keep talking, keep respecting each other's choices. She nodded, and together we returned to our gardening. The earth felt cool and rich beneath my fingers, promising new life. I thought about how Tom used to say that planting something in the ground was the ultimate show of faith in the future. Maybe that was what I was doing now, metaphorically, planting seeds of mutual respect, hoping they'd bloom into a healthier family dynamic. As the weeks progressed, Candace and Paul began discussing the idea of starting a family in a more tentative, open way than before. They asked me if I'd be willing to be involved when the time came. If they had children, would I be open to babysitting, to teaching them the old ways of tending a garden, to passing down the family stories? I said yes, of course. My heart soared at the thought of grandchildren running through these halls, hearing them laugh where once the echoes of the past hung heavy. Yet, I also made it clear that I was not a built-in nanny, that I would help out of love, not obligation. They agreed, smiling, acknowledging boundaries that once would have been trampled. Occasionally, I caught my reflection in the mirror and noticed the lines of my face, the streaks of gray in my hair, the slow stiffening of my joints. Age was creeping in, there was no denying it. But I no longer felt outdated or obsolete. I felt seasoned, aware of my worth. This house, my life, my family connections, none of them were guaranteed to be conflict-free, but they were mine. And I had learned that I had a voice, one that needed to be heard for the rest of the family to truly see me. I began hosting smaller, more intimate dinners with Candace and Paul, sometimes inviting close friends or distant relatives. The tension that once suffocated these gatherings was replaced by something more genuine, if cautious. Paul even surprised me by showing up one day with new seedlings for the garden, a variety of heirloom tomatoes, not the flashy hybrid ones. I thought he might appreciate these, he said, handing me the tray. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than he knew. We planted them together. He asked questions, listened to my instructions, and seemed genuinely interested in learning. A part of me recognized that I was witnessing his evolution, or at least his willingness to meet me halfway. When I finally told him how Tom and I first started our garden using seeds passed down from my grandparents, he actually seemed moved by the history. He asked more about Tom, about how we met, about how we decided to buy this house. I obliged, sharing stories I had held close for years. And as I spoke, I felt Tom's presence, that soft, guiding reassurance that all was unfolding as it should. Months passed, and the day came when Candace confided in me that they were expecting a child. She told me, in the kitchen, the same place I'd once clutched a cup of tea and felt so powerless. This time my hands were steady as I hugged her, tears of joy painting my cheeks. When Paul found out, he was ecstatic, talking about remodeling the spare room in their apartment to prepare a nursery. A couple of weeks later, he came to me. Yes, he actually came to me and asked for my opinion on decorations. on how to make the space feel warm and welcoming. The cynic in me wanted to think he was only being polite, but I saw genuine excitement in his eyes. He was letting me in, bridging that gap we had fought so hard to close. The seasons changed again, as they always do, and with them came new challenges. Candace's pregnancy had its ups and downs, and they occasionally considered moving closer to me for extra support. But I made it clear they could decide what was best for their family, as long as they didn't assume they could uproot mine. Paul smiled at that, a knowing, respectful nod. One day, while Candace rested in my old bedroom, she liked the quiet, she said, the sense of history that helped her relax. Paul and I found ourselves standing in the living room, staring at the walls. He spoke softly, almost as if he were afraid to break a fragile peace. You know, your email, it really caught me off guard. I guess I've never thought you'd fight back. I breathed in, remembering the cascade of emotions that had led me to that point. I should have spoken up sooner, I admitted, but I kept hoping you'd see me for who I am without me needing to spell it out. He gave a half smile, looking somewhat abashed. I thought I was doing the right thing, pushing for progress, for modernization. I didn't realize I was trampling over everything you hold dear. There was a vulnerability in his voice that I hadn't heard before, and it disarmed me. I placed a hand gently on his shoulder. We can move forward together, I said. We just need to remember we're all people with histories, with feelings. This house isn't just walls and floors. It's love, it's memories, it's family. He nodded, staring at the wooden beams overhead. Thank you for giving me another chance. I offered him a small, genuine smile. Your family, I replied simply. By the time the baby arrived, a beautiful, healthy boy, our relationships had found a new equilibrium. Paul and I weren't best friends, but we were something akin to allies, bound by mutual respect and shared love for Candace and the little boy who had suddenly become the center of our world. Candace often joked that the baby would grow up calling me the wise grandmother who stood her ground. That made me laugh, and even as my heart glowed with pride. On a warm afternoon, a few months after my grandson's birth, I was in the yard tending to the tomato plants we'd started from Paul's seedlings. He joined me, the baby strapped to his chest in one of those modern carriers. He looked slightly awkward, but determined. I showed him how to prune the vines, how to remove the suckers so that the plants could focus their energy on bearing fruit. As I demonstrated, he asked me about my childhood, about how my parents used to grow their own produce. The baby cooed, and I gently tickled his little chin, thinking how special it was that 3 generations were represented in that single moment. Eventually, Paul said, I guess some old ways still work, huh? He smiled, no sarcasm, no sting, just a genuine recognition. I couldn't help but grin back. Some of them do, I replied, carefully plucking a ripe tomato and holding it out for him to inspect. Other times, we adapt. It's about finding the balance. He nodded, the baby squirming, demanding attention. Paul adjusted him, chuckling. I'm starting to see that. I gazed at my grandson, imagining all the new traditions we'd create, all the old ones we'd preserve. Life was indeed about finding that balance. I thought I was losing my place in this family, but as it turned out, I just needed to reclaim it. And so I took the baby in my arms for a moment, bouncing him gently as Paul reached for the basket to collect tomatoes. We worked side by side, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. In the distance, I could see the shape of my home, a place that once echoed with heartbreak and fear. Now it was filled with possibilities, bridging past and future in a way that defied the notion of being outdated. My heart felt full. This was my life, messy and evolving, but undeniably mine. In the end, that email was more than just a statement of ownership. It was a declaration of self. I had shown them the deed, yes, but I had also shown them my heart, the part of me that refused to be minimized or cast aside. And as the sun set over the house I still called home, I realized that nothing about me was truly outdated. I was simply moving at my own pace, grounded in roots that ran deep, welcoming the future on terms that preserved my spirit. The gentle weight of my grandson in my arms reminded me that life continues, that new generations will walk these halls, that they'll learn from my stories and maybe even surpass me in ways I can't foresee. And through it all, I will remain a steady presence, anchored by love, by memories, and by the quiet strength that no one, not even a brash son in law, could ever take away.